Well, hi, I'm Hannah Watson, Director of Trolley Books, with Alixandra Fazzina outside Kate Daudy's tent in St Paul's Cathedral. And we are going to talk together about the themes of home and identity that the tent is bringing up, but also our particular perspective on that, which is through publishing and photography. A little background about me. Trolley Books is a publisher, independent publisher since 2001. We publish a lot of photography books, a lot of photojournalism, and we often focus on stories by photographers who spent a long time covering specific issues, especially around human stories. And we met in 2008, I think.
I think so, even if maybe a bit before that.
So Alex, why don't you say a bit about who you are?
So I'm Alexandra Fazzina. I'm a photographer and author. I started my career as a war artist and a frontline photographer for the news, covering various different front lines around the world. But most of my work looks at the consequences of war. One of those is obviously refugees, and has been a big focus of my work for the last 2 decades. Trying to really do quite investigative work and to really delve very deeply into people's stories. And I suppose really I could say that I'm a storyteller at heart. So yeah, I think we met in something like maybe 2007, I'm thinking.
2007. I remember you came into our place in Redchurch Street and you met Gigi. So you knew him. So Gigi was the founder of Trolley. He started Trolley and he died in 2012, but Trolley very much carries on his legacy. He was the driving force behind a lot of the publications. He was very political, very passionate about stories. So would you say when you met him, it was a kind of meeting of minds in some way?
Yeah, I knew Gigi for a while before that, and I suppose at that time I was speaking to him about a project I was working on between Somalia and Yemen. So I was investigating the hundreds and thousands of refugees that were fleeing from war in Somalia over to Yemen, and I was quite keen to do a book about it, and I suppose that conversation started back then.
So what made you want to start the story?
One of the things I think was really important about knowing Gigi and about Trolley and things was that a lot of the work I did before, if it gets published or it finds a home, it could be in editorial, it could be in a newspaper or on a gallery wall. But I suppose talking about Kate's tent and why we're here, I also think it's very important that you find sort of a better home for people's stories, for stories of refugees, for the platforms that we work on. And I think talking to Gigi, we tried to think of ways to use publishing and use the format of doing a book as a starting point to get that message across. And
well, when we met you, we met because it was geographical, because we were both in East London. And I think that you didn't have, now you're with an agency with Noor, but I remember when we met, you were very much on your own. And you came in and you showed us your work, and I remember Gigi getting really animated, really excited, and just wanting to somehow, and I remember you kind of being quite kind of calm and just smiling and talking, but Gigi, who's Italian, so he always got very excited by things. And I remember that first meeting, and then I think you were still going to Yemen, or you were living in Yemen sporadically. You were in the middle of the work?
I think when we first started talking about it, I'd just gone over and started to make some trips to investigate the story. I was doing some work for the Sunday Times magazine. And then I decided to go back and actually base myself, and I ended up living in Yemen for 2 years on and off to do the work. So it was, at that time.
And did you always, after you met us, I think it was pretty instant that we knew that the long-term goal was going to be a book, because that's obviously what we do. And did that guide what you were doing out there? Did you think this is the kind of context I can
Well, to me, it was
focus my work?
The focus of my work is photography, but to do a book, I write as well, and I really wanted to use that as a vehicle in order to sort of engage people with stories. I don't think most people would necessarily just pick up a book about refugees and start reading it, whether it be from Somalia or they be from wherever, Afghanistan, wherever they are in the world. But I think sometimes if you've got imagery and you have strong photographs and you can put those, that's a way of getting people and drawing them into the stories. So it was important in a way that I had the space, because for me, hearing the voices and getting real stories across and being able to convey perhaps more of a sense of understanding is very, very important. And it's not just in a journalistic way of going in and getting a quote about what happened on a journey, because that's what most news reporting does. It goes in and it just asks people questions about the very last point in time from when the two people are meeting. It's really going back and thinking about the whole essence of a life, and a life before the journey and where the journey takes you. Funnily enough, last week I was here for one of the events that Kate had going on around her tent, and there were two refugees from Sicily that had come up, and I was talking to one, and he was telling me that, you know, if people just only ask me about the journey, then they don't care about my life, they don't care about me. Like, it's very important that you go deeper than that.
I think also the focus in the news is often the numbers, and the numbers can sometimes you can lose track of what they actually represent. Each number is a life, essentially.
Well, yeah.
And then you go beyond the story of the number and you're looking at the bigger picture, basically.
And it is very important that people don't remain nameless. If you do even just look at how people react to imagery, especially things that have been in the news recently on refugees, where people do remain nameless, there's much less engagement with the story. I think sometimes photography has a sort of certain power that an image can really resonate with you and you can take it away. But if you can remember the story behind the image, or it forces you to actually engage with it in a deeper level, then that's even better. Like, we remember stories more than we even remember images, because we see so many thousands of them anyway.
And in terms of the way that these stories, what the stories are, I mean, they're not news stories in the sense that they're from a specific time and a place, they're long term. I remember you said something about the idea of, if we're talking about the idea of home, you said that losing your home is the most traumatic thing that can happen to anyone, and it was one of the most important things as human beings that you have.
Well, also losing your family and things as well. And often, you know, I regularly meet people that have lost both, that have lost loved ones and their home. And there's this, I mean, most of the stories, although there's a sort of dramatic element, they are just day to day. And I've always been very, very fascinated, especially in the war zones I've been working in, at just how much war has this kind of trickle-down effect that you don't realise. Like, it's not all about bomb blasts and bullets flying. It's that sort of day-to-day thing where your child's school closes and you can no longer access your money, and then your home gets damaged, and your reality of life completely changes. And I think as human beings, we all very much need exactly the same things in life. We need food, we need shelter, we need love. I mean, this is what drives us in life. So when you remove, you know, all of those, lives very quickly fall apart. But I suppose there's a sense going back that lives are also very ordinary, that we all do the same things, and then something breaks.
And the photographs that you take are not necessarily action photos or dramatic. They're kind of quieter.
I work very, very quietly and try to spend a long time speaking with people. Often I'm not getting out my camera and photographing straight away. It's about this sort of act of engaging with someone, and maybe sitting up late at night and telling stories about lives and picking up on sort of very small nuances, because I think that's where the strength in storytelling lies.
And how do you find it hard to develop relationships that then ultimately you have to leave?
Yeah, I do, because I really get quite close to people often when I'm working. And there's quite a lot of stories that I've gone back and revisited. And in fact, even in the last year, that I've been going back and updating the work that was doing previously in Somalia and Yemen. Because obviously shifting front lines in the region and the current war in Yemen has completely changed the dynamic. I also think it's very important to sort of set stories about refugees. It's not about a sort of, words I would ban, like these people or them or us, and using those kind of terms, which I feel are very derogatory. It's the fact that people are always on the move. People are moving now more than ever, whether it be war or climate change or poverty. People are pushed for lots of different reasons. And migration is constant. It's something that's not necessarily about it being on our doorstep. It happens all over the world for lots of different reasons. And one of the big things I think for me in my work is maybe to challenge where that fear of migration, which is often in people in Western Europe, think that they should be frightened of it, but actually to understand where that fear really comes from, and that's from the people that are actually on the move. That's from people like refugees. They're the ones who should be scared, not somebody here. So it's perhaps about collecting those stories and trying to show people what the truth is.
Do you think that showing individual stories is a way to better understand the bigger picture?
Definitely. I've tried to do that in lots of different ways. The book I did was Trolley Before A Million Shillings. It's sort of almost a collection of different people's stories as they sort of embark on a journey and where life takes them ultimately. Some of which are okay, some are not very pleasant. It's very hard. And even in that book one of the things I did originally set out to do was to follow particular people in the entirety of the journeys. But then so many people I did try to follow were lost or were killed by smugglers or died on the way that it became something impossible. So I suppose by getting lots of different stories, it sort of ultimately tells the bigger picture.
I remember the story of Salima. That was who had the baby on the boat.
I think that's one of the most dramatic stories I've told. And like you mentioned about revisiting people, and that's definitely one of the cases I did. There was a teenage girl I met who was from Mogadishu, and her husband and child had gone out one morning to buy bread, and there was a mortar attack, and they were both killed. And she was pregnant. Like I said, she was a teenager, and she decided to try and just escape from the war. So she went with the smugglers and made her way up towards Yemen, which is in itself a terrible journey. And then finally taking a boat, which is a sort of 3-4 day journey across the sea, she actually went into labour on the boat and gave birth with the help of some of the other refugees. And she said she passed out and she doesn't remember very much. But at the end, when she did come around, the smugglers literally picked up her baby and threw it into the sea. She said as if it was a ball. So when I met her and she'd arrived in Yemen, she was so vulnerable. And I met her actually in a kind of halfway house, which was run by traffickers. So traffickers in human smugglers, they pick up on the most vulnerable people. They know the people that have nothing and can be exploited. So she was most likely taken to be sold as a slave, as a housemaid or something in Saudi Arabia. And I did go back to try and find her, but she'd gone. So I guess she'd been sold.
Do you spend a lot of time thinking about what happens to people when you've lost touch?
Definitely. And it's been remarkable I was mentioning these trips I've been doing in the last year to try and update things. I've actually re-met people that I met 10 years ago, who I met actually trying to escape war in Somalia to Yemen, and then because of being refugees in Yemen have now had to escape back to Somalia. And they seem sort of very lost and very muddled lives between these different front lines and war zones.
So going back to this idea of home, you see a lot of people travelling, making their way onto the search for a better life. How do you, you're there living almost with them. How does that kind of affect how you live and work? Or you just, get on with it and assimilate into the kind of
I do
the
spend
way
a
of
lot
life
of time
there.
with people, and I think it's important. There's a lot of journalism or documentary work that's done, and people going to record different things that often just drop into something like a refugee camp for a few days and collect a couple of stories, and that's it, job done. But for me, I'd have really tried to live and work in the communities that I'm with, and experience that. And I suppose through learning languages, through different local things. I try to really get on with people.
Yeah, I find it, I always try and imagine you working, and how, I mean, as you are now, blonde, curly hair, we used to think, how does she access that? And it's always this idea of becoming, all photographers want to just be invisible, not draw attention to yourself. And I was watching a video of you working the other day, and it was just really nice seeing how your body language and the way you interacted with people. It was very quiet. It was like you were slipping around through people, sitting with people quietly, talking, getting their trust.
And it was unassuming as
very
well.
unassuming. And it wasn't like this war photographer image where you see often male, white, and kind of bursting in with big cameras and action. It was a very quiet, unassuming way of working, which I think says a lot about the ultimate work we produced. This long-term, quiet, going deeper. I think this is what the idea we're talking about.
Definitely, because there is very little work that does, but it's very hard to do, and people find it hard to maybe see value in it and what it can do, what it can achieve. Because also what's very important to me is when you're going and recording stories, or maybe writing a book, or creating a new body of work in my practice, that it needs to find a home. It needs to actually go somewhere and do something. There's no point going and making a coffee table book about refugees, or going and just having one article in a newspaper. I suppose for me, I feel like, I want to be a bit more of an activist about this and actually get people to wake up, to listen, to hear the stories. So that place where the work goes and what it can potentially do is also very interesting to me.
I think at Trolley, as publishers, I think Gigi never lost sight of the fact that he thought that by making a book, not only would you have, this was before the age of social media, but you would have thousands of people being able to see the story, but it was also a testimony, it was a permanent thing. And also it was something that could be put on people's desks. Lots of books. The Agent Orange book by Philip Jones Griffiths. Apparently there was a guy in the US Senate who said he was sick to death of people putting that book on his desk.
Well, that was also one of the very big ideas we had even when we did the publishing, and we worked closely together with the IOM and the UNHCR. In fact, Antonio Guterres, who was then the High Commissioner for Refugees, wrote the introduction, and we worked closely with lots of organisations. But the idea is that we printed lots of these copies, and they took them and they put them on the desks of people government bodies, people that funded them, trying to get them to pay attention. Because I think the way we pitched it to them was, well, look, most times you put an annual report on someone's desk, it's a few pages of A4, a PDF that they then sort of sit and maybe go through and move on. Whereas maybe if we put the book there as an object with the images, maybe it will kind of have the power to wake them up and to think about things in a deeper way.
It's also not just the images. I always think that you say if you're a photojournalist, I think you put the journalist into photojournalist as well, because there's all the stories, you're very thorough, you write lots of notes, you have all your notebooks. And it was the same as, with Stanley Green, he was the same, he always wrote everything down. He was an amazing amount of information. And that's also important, the information that bodies like the UNHCR need to have. It's the facts often.
But it's also important, I think. People work in different ways. And I am very aware that, if I was working, I'm not there just working in a refugee camp. Most of the world's refugees are in urban settings or pretty much in hiding and displaced in various different areas. And I'm sort of trying to track down those people whose sort of stories get skipped or their lives sort of go missing a bit more. And I'm not there. I'm collecting information in a very different way than an NGO or a UN agency or somebody else would be. I'm not just collecting statistics or getting a couple of quick statements or something.
Do you think people open up to you a bit more because you don't have an official...
I think so. I think people trust me to tell stories a lot more. Certainly when I started work, and if I think back 20 years ago, and again before social media, I think you were there and you were recording their story, and people really wanted to get their story out there. Now people have lots of different ways. But I still believe that people do, even if it's as a form of therapy. People really want to engage with someone, and the fact that someone actually takes the time to talk to you, which even in London doesn't happen very often, that people actually take an interest in your life, then you're willing to share very much.
And also this, I want to go back a little bit to the idea of, I still find it so amazing that you went off initially without any commission or backing. It was very much off your own instinct to do this story. And then ultimately, so the work was 2006, 2008, and then we had to wait a few years, because obviously making books is expensive.
It's not instantaneous, and it's
we
also a lot
needed
of
money.
work.
A lot of work, putting it all together, all the information, all the images, layout, going to festivals, getting permission for, who was it? Rahi
We worked
Taha.
with Rasha Taha
Yeah.
to use the music.
Yeah.
And we also didn't, I mean, it wasn't just like we went, we were there in Italy printing the book, and you come back and it's really amazing, you put something together. But the thing is, I think, especially working with Trolley and with Gigi, it doesn't stop there. It sort of goes on, and having a book is an amazing platform, because you can then go and talk about it on radio or on TV, or you can go and do talks, you can kind of actually shout about the issue. And that's what's sort of important to me. And also, perhaps engage with people that you would least expect. I mean, I think it was quite shocking. I found out that there was a book group in Texas reading my book on Somalia, which, for absolutely, out of the blue.
But also the Nansen Award, the UNHCR Nansen Award, that was the first time they'd ever given it to a photographer or a journalist. Usually it is given to...
Yeah, an incredible roster of people.
But I found that an amazing switch, that here was this award for recognising important work for refugees, and it had never been given to a journalist or a photographer before.
No, and it's something, I mean, it's quite astounding to me, because also I'm somebody that, in addition to working very quietly, I'm not someone that speaks very much about me and my work. I mean, for my job is to be sort of the middleman or middlewoman, getting the stories of refugees and people across, to be the storyteller. And I'm not sort of looking, to be recognised in that way, or it's about doing something different. So yeah, to be acknowledged for it is quite something. And obviously somebody does think that it makes a difference, and it is important, because like you said, I am working, it's very self-initiated. I'm going to do things because I think that there are important stories to be told. My ambition at school was always that I wanted to make a book. That was what, I told my careers officer. But for me, it's just important to go out and do this. There has to be a record. There has to be sort of a space and a place for people's stories to be told, because otherwise they'll just go be completely forgotten. Do
you feel that you're some way like a mouthpiece for people's individual stories, a bit like how the tent has got in their words on the outside? It's a kind of platform for their voice, not just the media voice.
Exactly the same way that Kate's put the words on the tent from people that she's met. Putting something on a piece of paper on a wall is exactly the same thing. It's very important.
Okay.